All right, let's get right into it. We're going to tackle one of the biggest turning points in all of human history, the agricultural revolution. We're always told it was our greatest achievement, but was it really? Or was it something else?
I mean, think about this. In what feels like the blink of an eye, geologically speaking, we went from picking wild grasses to creating this, a 99-cent double cheeseburger. It's an incredible symbol of abundance, right? But the story of how we got here, it all starts with a single, massive choice. Because the more we learn, the more we have to ask a pretty uncomfortable question. To get this cheeseburger, what did we actually have to give up? Is it possible this was the moment we traded a certain kind of freedom for a new kind of security?
Okay, so let's start with the story you probably heard in history class. It's a simple, straightforward tale of progress. Humanity was struggling, life was awful, and then bam, we invented farming and saved ourselves.
Yeah, this version of the story paints farming as a total game changer, and in a good way. We stopped running around, we planted some seeds, and suddenly we had all this free time for art, civilization, and, eventually cat videos on the internet. It's a really neat and tidy story. The only problem, the evidence says it's almost completely backwards. So let's take a look at what life was really like before we picked up the plow. When anthropologists started studying modern hunter-gatherer groups, they didn't find a bunch of miserable people on the brink of starvation. They found something so different, they had to give it a name: the original affluent society.
This quote from a Kalahari Bushman, it just says it all, doesn't it? These people weren't desperately looking for a new food source. To them, farming looked like a ton of work for not much reward. And you know what? When you look at the data, you really start to see their point.
So check this out. It's pretty stark. Foragers, they had an incredibly diverse and healthy diet. Early farmers, on the other hand, were suddenly relying on just a few crops, mostly starches. Foragers were healthier. They had better bones, better teeth, and their societies were pretty equal, It's tough to hoard wealth when you're always on the move. But the most shocking difference here? It's the workload.
Take a look at this number. Just 12 to 19. What in the world could that be? It's not what you think. It's actually way more surprising.
That is the average number of hours a forager worked in a week to get everything they needed. Food, shelter, the whole deal. The rest of the time, that was leisure. That was for art, for stories, for family. They had way more free time than many of us do today. So the big takeaway here is that farming wasn't a time saver. It was the exact opposite.
So if it wasn't some obvious upgrade, what was it? Well, it was a trade-off, a massive one. Humanity basically made a deal, and the price we paid for a steady, predictable food supply was incredibly high. And here's the core of that bargain. The upside was huge. You can't deny it. You could create a surplus of food. That surplus means you can have people who aren't farmers. You can have priests, soldiers, artists. It's what makes cities possible. But the downside? A catastrophic nosedive in health for the average person. Because now their diet was just wheat or rice or corn.
And you can literally see this trade-off written on our skeletons. It's wild. Archaeologists looked at ancient bones and found that after people switched to farming, the average height for men plummeted from a pretty healthy 5'9" down to about 5'3". That's a 6-inch drop. It's a huge red flag for widespread malnutrition. And it wasn't just poor nutrition. Settling down in one place created the perfect storm for diseases. You've got dense crowds of people, you've got waste contaminating the water, and you're living right next to your animals. This created a breeding ground for germs. Diseases like measles and smallpox, they jumped from animals to us, and they could only thrive in these new, dense farming communities. So what do we have? A population that's sicker, shorter, and working way harder. But that food surplus also allowed something entirely new to grow, the state. And it all begins with the simple politics of a field of grain.
The political scientist James C. Scott puts it about as simply as you can. Grains make states. But why? What's so special about grain? Well, it turns out it's the perfect crop for taxation.
Now, really, think about it. If you're a tax collector, a field of wheat is a dream come true. It all ripens at the same time, it's all above ground where you can see it and count it. You can divide it up into tiny little kernels, put it in a sack, and carry it away. And you can store it for years to feed an army or a bureaucracy. It's the foundation of state control. This completely flips our whole idea of what the early state was for. It wasn't just some benevolent organization there to protect everybody. Scott calls it a population machine. Its main job was to round people up, keep them in one place, and force them to grow that taxable surplus. You look at early law codes and they're obsessed with punishing people for running away. The state needed its workforce.
So, what does this ancient story have to do with us, today, right now? Well, everything. The consequences of that bargain made thousands of years ago are all around us. We are living inside the world that farming built.
I mean, just look at this timeline of our species. It's staggering. For over 95% of our time on Earth, we were hunter-gatherers. This whole world of cities, states, and hierarchies, it's an incredibly recent experiment. It's just this tiny little sliver at the very, very end of our story so far.
And that brings us back to our cheeseburger. It doesn't look like a simple symbol of progress anymore, does it? It's the complicated, improbable result of that 15,000-year-old trade-off. It represents the incredible surplus that makes our world possible, sure, but it's also a legacy of the inequality, disease, and control that came right along with it.
At the end of the day, the switch to farming became a trap. Once populations grew and the wild lands disappeared, there was no going back. It was an irreversible choice. Which leads to one last question for all of us. What irreversible choices are we making right now with consequences we can't even begin to imagine? And how will people thousands of years from now look back at the trade-offs we decided were worth it?